Thank you, Andy. I'm a landscape architect, and several years ago I started a design firm called Dirtworks. It's based on the simple idea that dirt works, that nature can provide balance in our lives, and with design can help address the sense of isolation. Thank you. I have a very soft voice, so I will apologize if Louis, if y'all can't hear me in the back, please raise your hand. Thank you, thank you. Very good. Excellent. Let's try that. I started this firm with the basic belief that dirt works, that nature can provide balance in our lives, and that with design can help address the sense of isolation and vulnerability that comes with illness. And my career has been guided by, I would say, a single inspiration, and that's the power of the human spirit to endure. I think this image captures a lot of that power. Seed, the symbol of hope and promise. It is something that's shared by everyone, regardless of culture and capability. And over the years in our work, I've seen that manifest itself in many ways. From an individual recovering from a stroke, addressing that sense of loss by finding some sense of normalcy. For a victim of violence, finding the strength to start anew. And for a child with autism, that sense of delight that comes with that first smell of basil. I believe that design with nature can create the setting, and as Dean and I were talking about last night, the opportunity for the body to do what it does, to restore, to renew, and to heal. Together, they can connect us to ourselves and connect us to something larger. That something larger is what I call the fabric of health. It's the threads that unite us all. It's the threads that help create resiliency against the forces that we face every day. And it also can help coalesce individual ideas of health with collective ideas of health to help build both public and personal health. And third, I also believe that this design setting should be discreet. It should not demand presence. Design can be the quiet hand that can support when needed and can step away when it's not. What I want to do is share with you several projects that we've done that help convey this idea. One is a public garden that was designed for in a public setting to welcome individuals regardless of capability. The second is more specific. It's actually a facility designed for kids with autism. Actually, I'll back up a slide here. Oh, I'm sorry. Most of my work over the years has been concentrated in the very controlled and I'll say very specialized setting of healthcare. But when you design for health in the public realm, it begins to create a very different set of complex challenges. And that, in a sense, means accommodating diverse needs. Strength, stamina, sunlight sensitivity, sensory sensitivity, awareness, and orientation. Those are the kinds of challenges one faces not only in healthcare, but in a public setting. And I purposely chose a public garden as my first project to convey those same kind of complex challenges one finds in healthcare. And one of the things that we do in every garden is simply say, we're glad you came. That means providing a sense of welcome and accommodation with what I call invisible details. There are details that matter when you need them. Some are quite obvious. In this garden, there's a very clear pathway, there's a bench, a destination at the end. There's a subtle dapplation of light so that an individual can adjust to sunlight, particularly for an aging eye. But there's also hidden details, and I'll talk about those throughout this next set of gardens. There's an edge along the pathway to help guide a wheelchair, a cane, or a stroller. The pathway is wide enough for somebody to turn around quickly if they've changed their mind. That's the kind of sensitivity that designers need to bring to these sorts of spaces. We often try to design and balance very specific therapeutic qualities with simply the idea of surprise and delight. This is a lawn panel in the garden. It's very pleasant to look at, but it has a hidden level of meaning. It's designed with a type of bluegrass called supine bluegrass. It holds the weight of a wheelchair. So an individual in a wheelchair can roll out to the middle. A therapist can take off the shoes, and this individual can actually run their toes through the grass. This individual is getting to tickle their toes. the therapist is getting an exercise. Now, it may actually hurt a little bit, but it tickles as well. Those kinds of moments are the kinds of dialogue that I think designers and medical practitioners can have to make these spaces sing. Another thing to keep in mind is the idea of accommodating varying levels of strength and stamina. In a sense, you can use distinct microclimates within a very short distance. So here is an individual in a wheelchair. They can go from the warm sunlight of these grasses to the cool shade of the underneath the tree, back to the warm grasses with very little effort. You can also use grade change to begin to define these distinct settings. Here we've used a wall that creates a separation between a contemplative garden and another garden space that might be much more active and lively. This particular wall has a number of wonderful features, which I'll talk about. One is a number of water features, and water is a beautiful thing to explore. This particular slide shows water that falls, a thin series of rivulets, falls a very tall distance into a shallow basin for a very bright sound. Elsewhere, we've used water that falls, a very wide trough of water that falls a short distance into a basin for a deep, dark, meditative sound. You can calibrate the sound of the water for very specific reasons. Also, sometimes you have to make an effort. A lot of our garden features require a certain level of strength and stamina. We think it's very important to actually try to begin to build in personal goals. Test yourself. Not everything should be easy in these spaces. That's the kind of give and take that designers need to have with their clients, particularly in a medical setting. But here, this individual has to reach in order to touch the trickling water that actually falls inside. What they're doing is they're getting upper body strength. They're actually exercising their upper body. You can also create microclimates by simply using the canopy of a tree to capture the moisture that's inside a trickling waterfall that's right here. It's a very, very subtle feature. The idea is that it celebrates those who pause. Not everyone will have that moment, not everyone will stay long enough, but for those who do pause, it's a beautiful, subtle moment. The wall itself has lots of wonderful features, things to smell, to taste, but in the process you have to bend, you have to reach, you have to stretch. Those are the kinds of things that we want to incorporate. These invisible details that actually bring a level of exercise and wellness into your garden experience. This is an inclined path that has a series of subtle places to stop and pause. Each one of these places has a feature. You can stop, you can catch your breath very privately. Nobody needs to know. This is actually an essential invisible detail to make sure that individuals who might have an embarrassing condition can recapture a moment. So this subtle place on this walkway to simply pause allows somebody to catch their breath in a very private manner. That, in a sense, is the essence of what these garden spaces need to be about, to allow an individual to find that balance, to capture that sense of equilibrium back into their lives. Also, another place to pause might simply be a path or leading to a little side area. This little visitor is a little hesitant. Here's a spot that he can begin to discover nature on his own terms. Overlooks are another wonderful example of a place to pause. These particular handrails are custom designed so that it can grasp an individual with, let's say, a certain level of grasping strength, might be arthritis or whatever, but the handrails are slightly wider, so it's easier to grasp. They're wood. It's warmer to the touch. And on the back side, we've incorporated poems in Braille. The idea is to come across these moments and to sort of say, it might be a poem by Auden or Whitman or something else like that, but it's that kind of subtlety of surprise, not only for those who read Braille, but quite frankly for those who don't read Braille, to leave the garden beginning to think about, gee, what are they experiencing? What are they seeing? And these poems change all the time. Other parts of the garden are very immersive. This is an area where we have a very, very narrow path. The planters rise up around you, and 12 different varieties of basil cascade over the side. When you're in this moment, you're surrounded by basil. You become one with the basil.
but the rest of the garden and the rest of the world disappears. Those moments of immersion are really wonderful to try to create. One of the nice features we never planned on in this garden, but it's a beautiful serendipitous moment, is the basil rubs off on your sweaters, and you take that smell home with you. We've often used that, particularly for individuals or nursing homes or whatever. At the end of the day, for an individual with dementia to take off their sweater and for the nurse to hold it up and say, "Smell this, remember what you did today." Those wonderful ways that you can extend that garden moment long beyond the actual space of the visit itself. The same space not only is a wonderful space for an individual, it's a space for groups. We think it's very important to create opportunities for groups to gather, share stories, to experience things together. In this particular part of the garden, the walls change in height very, very gradually, almost like a Goldilocks set of walls. You'll find the height that's right for you right now. Eventually, these walls reach a certain point where they're high enough that you can rest against. There's a little indentation for your toes so that you can come right up against the wall. The wall is wide enough that you can put gardening tools on. Those sorts of subtle moments are what creates these sorts of garden spaces, making sure everyone can be engaged at the level that they want to be. Also, just create wonderful spaces to do things together. So much of this intimacy that happens in therapy happens often in a group, and it sometimes happens with an individual. But these sorts of collective moments are moments to share together. This kind of dynamic in a public setting is very difficult to achieve. One of the things that we've been trying to find ways is that we can balance the very intimate, very personal aspects of therapy and incorporating that into a garden setting, into a public setting. That dynamic between private space and public space occurs not only in a garden, let's say you're in a public garden, it also occurs in a healthcare setting, is to really understand that balance and that dynamic between indoor space, between public space and very private space. I think in many respects, this garden really talks about the idea of creating a personal connection with nature. And so much of this design effort is really looking at the idea of providing opportunity and choice. Opportunity for each individual to engage with nature in their own way, on their own terms, and at their own pace. This idea of providing opportunity and choice is essential when you're dealing with autism. It's a complex condition. I was mentioning last night at dinner, if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. One of the wonderful challenges of designing, particularly for autism, is that it makes you think very carefully about that individual experience of nature. Each child is different. One child may have certain preferences and strengths, another child may have just the opposite. How do you create a setting that can engage them all? It's what I think one of the great challenges for design, as Dean and I were talking about last night. I wish you all could have been part of that conversation because it's picking right up on what I want to talk about now. But it's really looking at how design can make that individual, that very personal connection to an individual in nature. This particular garden is a school for children on the autism spectrum in Florida. It was completed about a year ago. These photographs were taken, I would say, about 2 months after its opening. It's in Florida, and you will see why in a minute, but the plant material is quite young. But one of the things that we tried very carefully in this garden is to think about process and building a close relationship with the teachers and the therapists. We needed to understand what they do and how might that be achieved in a garden setting. So one of the things that we began to think about, and part of the design process, was doing a series of diagrams. It's often very difficult to understand plans, and so we often would develop these types of diagrams that would begin to sort of talk about very specific conditions. Things like circulation, focused sensory input, accommodation, structured space, all within a very lush garden setting. And I want to walk you through each one of these. In this particular garden, I would say it's about a 3,000 square foot space. We wanted to introduce two entrances to the garden, one for younger kids, one for older kids. but there's a clear circulation through the garden itself, and a hierarchy of circulation from very clear destinations to much more subtle destinations, to some of the most intimate spaces within. So the garden itself enters from both ends, as you can see here. There's one main circulation route, and then a series of smaller garden paths that come off to the sides. One of the things that we tried to create in this garden was really begin to calibrate the level of sensory input one child may want to have. So we developed what we call sensory rooms. These are garden spaces that would focus on one specific sense. So we might have one garden space, and that's what's running through the center of the garden here. One that might focus on sight, one might be on smell, one might be on sound or whatever, but isolate that sense. So that child has the choice to go into that space or avoid it. It's one of the things that we wanted to think about, creating very intense areas of sensory stimulation, but then also create spaces that were just the opposite, to get away from that level of sensory stimulation. And that's what I'm calling here accommodation, is that the spaces are very clearly identified. It's very clear that there's two main activity spaces once you enter the garden. The sensory rooms run through the middle, and then off to the side are something that I call a place away. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. It's, in a sense, meant to be a much more calming, soothing, almost a womb-like space. Finally, all this needs to be in a very structured space. One of the things that we wanted to think about was using routine, pattern, and repetition to help support wayfinding. So the garden has very structured space and very unstructured space. I'm going to walk you through the garden here now. As I said, the garden was just not long after it's planted. It's now grown, like things do in Florida, much more lushly now. But the idea here was we were using palm trees to create a series of columns. They, in a sense, would help define the main circulation. The trees actually formed the entrances into the gardens, the sensory rooms as well. The sensory rooms run down the center of the space here. It's what unites the entire garden. If you notice, the planters rise up and then they fall down so that we can create a wonderful immersive experience for these kids, but the teachers can see all the spaces at one time. That idea of understanding not only spaces that have to be that not only have to address actual safety, but perceived safety. The perception of safety is something that's essential for a designer to begin to explore. As I said, each one of these garden spaces are immersive. There's a wonderful chance to sort of experience one particular scent. They're immensely popular, as you can probably imagine. The far end of the garden is, in a sense, something we call the welcome lawn. It's where the younger kids arrive into the garden. It's where they let off steam. That's where they can begin to create a sense of balance. They get a sense of orientation before they go out into the garden to start exploring. This particular lawn panel is also used for yoga, for stretching, for dance exercises. But that idea of coming to a place and coming back to that place before you depart the garden and go back into your classrooms was a wonderful sense of orientation and a place of sort of grounding yourself. At the opposite end of the garden is where the older kids enter. And these, we've created a series of what we called learning circles. They're spaces, in a sense, they've got these sort of treetop tables and stump seats. As you can imagine, the kids love to count the tree rings over and over and over again. But these spaces are meant to be very focused activities. One of the things that we found here, the need to create personal space was essential. When I first, if I can share a little anecdote here, when I first walked this facility, they have a small exterior garden that's actually a golf course, a small golf course for the kids. And when I was walking around with the director of programs, she shared a wonderful story that when they first brought the kids out to this small golf course, it was funded by a professional golfer, as you can probably imagine. They couldn't control the kids. The kids were just going bonkers. They were running from one end of the garden to the other, and they just couldn't find a way to keep all the kids together. And so the staff was saying, "We need more staff." And Marlene, the director of programs, said, "Well, we can't afford more staff. Let's go into the garden shed and see what we've got." Well, they had a whole series of hula hoops that they used to help build certain types of muscular imbalance and things like this with the kids. So she brought the hula hoops out and gave each kid a hula hoop. And all of a sudden the kid would put the hula hoop on the ground. That was personal space. What they need was some sense of defined space. So when they go elsewhere, the kids pick up the hula hoop and they travel it to another spot. What's wonderful is Marlene has now put that onto their website because they actually become a great resource for autistic programs around the world. So that same hula hoop is being made out of willow branches in Norway. It's being made out of cane branches in South Africa. That simple idea of using a hula hoop was a wonderful sense of creating personal space. Well, that's what this band does here. It creates that sense of personal space. It helps these kids reduce anxiety. It helps them focus, particularly for these kinds of activities. This idea that I mentioned a moment ago about the sense of privacy, the sense of safety, perceived safety, and actual safety, also applies to privacy. We wanted to make sure that the staff could see across the entire garden, but we needed to create a sense of separation to the spaces. So we often use plant materials that you would see underneath, plant materials that had, in a sense, multi-stems that you would look through. It's a bit of a veil. In a sense, it's not creating actual privacy, it's creating perceived privacy. The idea of allowing somebody that sense of separateness, that sense of privacy, but still allowing staff to see across the whole space. This is a view of one of those place-aways that I mentioned. We have 3 or 4 of them. Each one of these are different. These are immersive spaces. They're meant to be spaces that are, like I said, about a cocoon. Each one of the spaces has a series of pebble seats. Some of the pebbles are concave, some are convex. The whole idea is to begin to think about how one sits. It's for vestibular goals. The pebbles themselves have, in a sense of balance, so we chose each one of those pebbles carefully. But the idea here was to create this sort of separate space here where teachers could work very specifically on certain therapeutic goals. Elsewhere in the garden are a series of great water features. If you notice, you have to bend, you have to reach, you have to stretch in order to use these. All these garden elements were designed specifically with the staff so that we could look at very specific therapeutic needs. It also builds ownership in the garden. The staff owns the garden, so the garden can change as their ideas change. And one of their current ideas are patterns. Here, we're in a sense, we're using patterns in the stepping stones and a series of chimes that happen through the garden, and actually in the plant materials themselves. We're also using these musical instruments. They happen throughout the garden. These also begin to build motor coordination skills, but one of the most beautiful things is it helps build social skills for nonverbal kids. And the staff is now beginning to observe these wonderful musical dialogues that are happening between nonverbal kids. I'll tell you, there are some magical moments in this garden. I think in many respects, this is a garden of discovery, not only for the kids, probably for the teachers, but certainly for its designer. I think it talks about the power of design to use opportunity and choice to help with health and healing. And I think I'll end with where I began, when we begin to think about design. Design can provide that steady hand when it's needed and can back away when it's not. And on that, I'll close. Thank you all.